Thank you all for joining us here today, and thank you to those people who are stuck on the Beltline making their way here, because I understand there's some traffic issues. We have, or will have, a great turnout today. We have over 130 people registered to join us. And I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors. At the platinum level, we have Delta Dental of Wisconsin and National Cooperative RX and Novo Nordisk. At the silver sponsor level, Group Health Cooperative of South Central Wisconsin. As a bronze sponsor, Pfizer. And a diamond sponsor, the National Hemophilia Foundation and Novo. Please make sure to visit their tables at the back of the room to learn more about their services. So here's what's in store for today. The educational portion of our meeting is going to focus on specialty pharmacy, one of, I'm sure you know, the fastest growing areas of your healthcare spend. And we have a lineup of speakers who will help you not only understand these costs and the policy landscape, but also what you can do to begin to manage them. Between speakers, we'll hold our annual business meeting of the cooperative, and this is our 28th anniversary, which we are marking with the theme Alliance Answers. And you'll be hearing more about that from Larry Pribble, our vice chair, who will provide some remarks. We'll also share the results of our electronic voting process on board members and our health policy resolutions. Paul Meyer, the CEO and treasurer of our cooperative, will fill you in on our financial performance, and I'll provide some brief remarks in my CEO report. You will also notice that we have a video crew here today. We're doing some person on the street interviews to get your perspectives on primary care, and particularly on high value primary care. We want to hear what you like, what you don't like, and what you think needs to be improved. We hope you participate and share your candid feedback, and with your consent, we plan to use excerpts of these interviews to inform our members and other employers about what we want in the way of primary care. This is part of work that you'll be hearing about in the coming months, about a focus of ours on really improving high-value primary care in our community. In your folders, you'll find our annual report summary, which includes key highlights of our work to move healthcare forward, and you can read the full annual report on our website. So let's get started. Our title for today's educational program is Keeping a Lid on Specialty RX Costs. You're all familiar with the rate of price increase in this area, and to counter the trend, employers need to act now to control how they cover specialty pharmaceuticals. Many employers are also looking for less expensive alternatives, such as biosimilars, which we will also explore. Alex Young will start us off with an overview of American Patients First, the Trump administration's plan to lower drug prices and patient out-of-pocket costs. Alex Young is managing director in the Parthenon EY practice of Ernst & Young LLP, where she works primarily on strategic transformation projects. Alex has worked with many healthcare and life sciences companies across the country, developing and implementing large-scale plan design and funding strategies, such as the introduction of consumer health-driven care plans, health savings accounts, health improvement initiatives, including on-site pharmacies and clinics. Alex led corporate strategy at Walgreens and has performed work on several large-scale transactions, mergers, and acquisitions, including the divestiture of Walgreens Pharmacy Benefit Manager. She is a regular speaker at many events and has been quoted in numerous articles in the Chicago Trib, Business Insurance, Workforce Magazine, Management Magazine, and other industry publications. Please join me in welcoming Alex Young.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to try to make this presentation a little bit more palatable for you, because what I'm reviewing today are pending regulations, which aren't necessarily a interesting topic. What we've tried to do, and we've been giving this presentation since the blueprint came out in June, so you'll see that some of the information in here has already started to become a bill in the Senate and in the House, and I'll talk about the updates as recently as this week of how those bills are advancing. And we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are, not just to the value chain, but to employers specifically, and why these are very, very likely to pass. There's a lot of debate over whether or not HHS and CMS have the authority to move forward with these bills. What I can tell you, having spent time in Washington, is that they are not just going through an agency. They're actually making it through Congress, and there have been both closed door and public hearings and public open RFI for comment documents available for the general public to respond to. So this is a very active regulatory agenda. It's not just rhetoric. And I can tell you from having been in these sessions with the doors closed that the language has already been written. It's just being tweaked. So with that, I'm going to go through a summary of what we believe is a pretty well-organized way to look at the regulations, because they're pretty lengthy, and they obviously are written in legalese. So what we attempted to do as a firm was to translate them into layman's terms so that you can understand their implications. So with that, this is something that came out in May. So it's been going on for a couple of months now, and it was announced by the president. And people always say to me, does Trump really know what he's doing when it comes to health care? The reality is Trump is not driving this. He's just the mouthpiece for it. It's being driven by two federal agencies, one which is the FDA under Scott Gottlieb, and two, CMS HHS under Alex Azar. And for those of you that don't know who Alex Azar is, he's the former CEO of Eli Lilly. He comes from within the industry and absolutely understands how the flow of money works, and he's a veteran of the industry. He has actually taken quite a bit of criticism for attacking some of his former colleagues and his former brethren. So when people ask me about the veracity of his integrity, I can tell you that the man has suffered some pretty public criticism for the stance that he's taken, and there have actually been some threats against him. So he's taking some pretty serious personal risks and sticking his neck out on this issue. What people don't realize is when you go on a public forum, like I do even, you do get threats. There are some crazy people out there who see you as a threat to their livelihood or their job, and they take it very seriously, and not everybody in this country is mentally stable. So I don't think anyone's going to take the risks of putting their neck out there to talk about these topics if they weren't sincere about them. So with that, there are 4 categories of these proposals, and we tried to break them down as much as we possibly could. Now, the one thing that's interesting about this is the reception that it got from the American public and from the investment community, which I find very ironic, and I'll show you some slides at the very end that illustrate how out of touch Wall Street is with the reality of what goes on in the healthcare industry. Very, very few people really understand how healthcare economics work. They may understand how the healthcare value chain works and how service is delivered and what business models look like, but very, very few people follow the numbers. And a lot of that has to do with who's in the industry and how it's being led. Most of the financial information that flows through this industry is confidential for a reason. It is protected because there is so much profiting going on that if the general public really knew what was happening with their premium dollars, there would be a massive uproar. This is but one area of healthcare. It only represents 15 cents on every dollar. And the fact that there's this much controversy over a small component goes to show you what's still in the system. We haven't even begun to talk about the medical side of benefits and what goes on in hospitals and what goes on in provider groups. We haven't even scratched the surface. So think about the rhetoric and the vitriol that has arisen over drug prices. Drug prices, which represent 15% of total healthcare spend. It's going to get worse. This is just the beginning. Because what we live in today that a lot of people dismiss is a transparent society. This didn't happen because some of us took up the mantle and said we need to change the way we pay for care. This happened because we have social media. And people at the ground level started sharing information on the internet and on Facebook and on Twitter. And they started sharing information about what they were actually paying for products. And it created transparency, and questions started getting asked. These are grassroots efforts that drive a lot of what's happening here. And it's just the beginning. So with that, here's what the proposal contains. There are 4 major categories, and some of the language here isn't proper grammar, so you'll have to excuse the English. It was written by congressional aides, and some of the language is like consulting speak. They made up their own words. You'll see when I get there. So there's a couple of things in the outline. The first thing is that there's a theme around this, and this has to do with how incentives work in the system. This is very focused on the incentives in the system. Incentives meaning how money creates influence and how money is being used to drive behavior. The second component of that is the goal of these initiatives and what they're intending to do from an outcome perspective and why they're being categorized the way they are. And then the third component is what's called a mechanism of action. The mechanism of action is actually the way the policy is going to bring about change. Most of the mechanisms of action here are legislative in nature, but they will require fundamental changes in the administrative and operating infrastructure of the industry. Of course, because this is a political environment, there have to be some accomplishments claimed, and you've heard our president talk about how he has pared down price increases from certain drug companies who announced drug increases earlier this year and how he beat them up and got them to talk to him and agree not to increase their prices. A lot of that's rhetoric. It's a show. Those conversations didn't just happen by accident. All of it was precipitated by conversations that took place way before it made it onto Twitter. And the agencies that are responsible for these directives have been working on this way longer than anybody realizes. Much, much, much more before it ever made it into the newspapers. The work on this started the day they took office, and they came in with an agenda. The reason these people got appointed into these positions was because they came to the president with an agenda. So the categories that they're most interested in are first and foremost increasing competition. There is a wide acceptance of the fact that we have a monopsony in the United States and massive convergence and consolidation, which most of you might think is probably not a bad thing, except that it does one very important thing. It changes the balance of power and the ability of employers to negotiate. When you have a fragmented base on one side and a highly consolidated base on the other, you lose negotiating leverage, which takes power away from you and transfers it to those who are highly organized. That has happened as a matter of business practice. The mergers and acquisitions throughout the last 10 years have resulted in these giant companies on purpose. They're publicly traded companies with boards of directors who are pushing their CEO to create as much scale as possible to protect existing revenue streams for the benefit of their shareholders. And they had to converge in order to control and protect their negotiating leverage through scale. The employer community, on the other hand, can't do that. The best you can do is organize through coalitions. And to be quite frank, and those of you who've heard me speak on this before, I can tell you you've been very sloppy and unorganized about it. So you have abdicated a significant amount of your power in negotiating leverage to these massive corporations, and now you lament the fact that you can't change anything. The second part of this has to do with bettering negotiations. That's that consulting speak. There's no such word as bettering. It's called improving. Anyway, I took a little issue with it when I saw it, but it's actually focused on Part D. So the other thing that people tell me is that this has nothing to do with employer-sponsored health care and it won't affect plans that are not government plans, and that's not true, and you'll see why. This absolutely impacts self-insured employers. They start with Medicare Part D. What you haven't seen yet is the rest of the language. In that competition phase, by the way, I forgot to mention that this has to do with generics and the fact that biosimilars are having a difficult time entering the market to create necessary competition for branded products, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The third piece is lowering list prices. Now, here's an interesting topic, the topic of price and what it is defined by. There's lots of definitions for a drug price. There are lots of benchmarks for a drug price. There's a big difference between a net price, a list price, and a wholesale price. And there are lots of incentives that influence final price or the paid value that's adjudicated at the point of sale. So the word price, what you don't see and what isn't public, is how it's been defined. And the myriad of definitions that have been documented by law school students that are interns in the Washington White House. They've chronicled dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of the word price, how it's calculated, what it means, and how it's derived. What they're trying to do here is to ensure that discounts and rebates are passed along to intended patients, and I'll come back to why in a minute. There's lots of debate by the PBMs around whether or not they're passing on these rebates today. Doesn't matter whether you are or you aren't, unless you're doing it consistently at 100% of the rate, 100% of the time, there's a problem. Even if only 5% of employers don't get all their rebates, that's a problem. Even if it's not in their contract, that's a problem. That money wasn't intended to be used as profit. The intent of those incentives was to help patients pay for their drug. And we'll come back to this because it's a very contentious topic. Some drug companies are actually defending the PBM practices, which I find fascinating because this is money that they're actually giving the PBM. And then lastly, lowering out-of-pocket costs. Now, this topic ought to be very important to you. And this has to do with affordability. We have a massive problem in the United States where there is a big disconnect between the average employer's plan design and the average employee's salary and whether or not they can actually afford their health care. It has caused a massive problem in the United States where it is driving bankruptcies, poverty, wage inflation, or wage deflation, I should say, wage compression. And there is a massive movement to, at some point, address high deductible plans. It's not quite in this bill yet, but it's coming. And it has to do with the transfer of risk to the average American and how that's driving impact to the economy and people's ability to spend because there's no disposable income available. So with that, let's go to the first one, increasing competition. And this has to do with generics and biosimilars. For the last 15, 20 years, we have been pushing a generic conversion or generic substitution agenda in the United States, and we have a very, very efficient use of generics in this country as compared to other countries in the world. In Europe, the rate's very low. It's like 40%. The United States, we're creeping up in about close to 75 to 80% use of generics. We have a very efficient use of low-cost pharmaceutical products in this country, and no one ever admits that. 80% are generics. Now let's step back and take a look at that for a second, because what does that mean? Most formularies include a requirement that a generic, if it's available, it has a lower price, be substituted at the point of sale if it's not written as dispense is written. The price of the average generic in this country is pretty low. It's about $10 a month. That's a very efficient price for drugs, and we don't give credit where credit is due. We have done a phenomenal job in this country of keeping drug prices low. There are 10,000 licensed products in the United States. About 200 of them are the most commonly used, and they represent 80% of prescriptions. And those drugs can be purchased for less than $10 a month. So when we talk about high drug prices, please keep in mind that you're talking about outliers. High drug prices do not apply to the general average at all. In fact, we have a very, very inexpensive system in the US. So with that, there is another problem because we still have lots of branded products out there that could be generics, that are in the specialty category, that could be what are called biosimilars. The problem with biosimilars are twofold. One, the price point, and two, there isn't generalized acceptance of them yet. So they're not making it into the market because there are some practices that are being perpetuated by certain drug companies that are preventing their introduction by the generics manufacturer. They play games with the what is called the loss of exclusivity or the patent expiration. They play games with when they will actually hand over the formulation or allow for the conversion to the generic product. There's this window of 180 days after the patent expires in which they are, in most cases, supposed to transfer that formulation over to a generics manufacturer, and that gets delayed. In fact, some drug companies will actually pay for the delay so that they can protect market share for their branded product for as long as possible. Well, that's fine. If the average American wants to pay for it, and if your plan wants to pay for it, that's fine. The reality is what it has done is it's actually stifled the introduction of biosimilar generics in the market, which are significantly lower price against a specialty brand. So what Congress wants to do, and I say Congress intentionally because I'm going to come back to how they're involved now, is to take a look at all of the drugs that were in the pipeline in the FDA that were awaiting approval because there was a backlog. So part of the problem was a backlog in the FDA and getting approvals for those products. And they ended up throwing money, literally throwing money at the FDA agency and letting them hire more people to expedite the approval process. And in 2017, there was massive approval rates. I mean, they were doing this like crazy, hundreds of drugs a month, and it flooded the market with approvals. And there's still a backlog. There was a 5-year backlog on approvals, and they're still catching up. There's also what they're calling the Drug Competition Act, or the Drug Competition Action Plan. It's not an act, it's a plan, to try and improve the process and close some of those loopholes that branded manufacturers are using to delay the introduction of generics. They're also looking at ending this indefinite 180-day exclusivity extension. So there are ways that a drug company can file an extension to keep their exclusivity beyond the 180-day period. The FDA wants to stop that process. And they also want to be able to identify biosimilars with their own code. So there is a movement to create a code in the Medicare Part D billing taxonomy that can identify those biosimilars independently of other products so that they can be split out on the bill, especially in Part B, where they're bundled into the hospital bill. Sometimes they are not individually identified because they are bundled into what's called a unibill. So HHS wants to be able to see the actual price of the drug, and I'll come back to why later. So the directives there are also going to include what's called risk mitigation strategies, REMS. These are programs that are used by drug companies to evaluate risk of a product, and some of those processes are actually used to delay or block the introduction of a generic by a competitor. And then obviously education. So a lot of this has to do with improving the speed at which generics get introduced into the market so that we can reduce the amount of money that's being paid to high-priced brands. Remember, high-priced brands, however, make up less than 20% of all drugs prescribed. And when we talk about high-cost specialty drugs, those that go over $50,000 a year, those are outliers. You can count them on one hand. There are 10,000 products out there. And all the articles you read about are about 5 products. The discussion in this country is focused on 5 things, when it ought to be focused on the broader discussion around what we have on our formularies and whether or not we should even have formularies or whether or not we should even be paying for some of this stuff. And what they're trying to do with this particular provision is to encourage generic competition. But for those products that are recently introduced as specialty products, there is no generic competition. Patent laws exist for a reason. So I'm going to flip the coin a second and talk about the fact that drug companies spend on average $1 to $2.5 billion of investor capital, because they're publicly traded companies, to do research and development on these breakthroughs. They have to make up that cost somewhere. They're publicly traded companies. And until and unless we as a country turn the process of research and development into a tax-funded national agency, we have no choice but to pay for it through publicly traded capital. And those organizations have a profit mandate, not a motive, a mandate. They have to make up this investment. What I tell audiences all the time is be careful not to demonize this process. It will result in less and less innovation, less and less experimentation, and less discovery. And if any of you have spent any time outside of the United States, you know how dangerous this is becoming already. Nobody is researching antibiotics right now. It's a massive global problem. We have antibiotic-resistant viruses. We don't have antivirals for them. Why? Because these companies have a profit motive and a profit mandate to go after things that are profitable. And until we change the national dialogue about what's important to us from a disease criteria perspective, that's not going to change. But demonizing the researchers is not the way to go. What we need to have is a constructive dialogue about which diseases we need to prioritize. The second component has to do with this bettering negotiations. And this has to do with Part D. They're specifically going after Part D because that's what they can attack first. Trust me when I tell you there's other language pending that will eventually get to employer plan sponsors, self-employed or self-insured employer plan sponsors. So in this particular provision, what they're looking at is demonstration projects. So those of you that are familiar with Medicaid, Medicare, Medicaid too, they use block grants to fund demonstration projects. CMMI, which is a component of the agency, will give block grants to community-based healthcare providers to run demonstration projects to see whether or not they can demonstrate better outcomes for different ways of doing things. So there's some money being appropriated, and there's a directive under CMS to develop what are called value-based care models. And this has to do value-based. When you hear the word value-based or outcomes-based, what that means is risk sharing. It's about a collective sharing risk. Everyone thinks it's about paying for outcomes or paying for value and demonstrating this outcome that a reimbursement is made up against. It's not. These are tiered risk-sharing agreements where all parties take a portion of the dollars coming in and they share the risk. These are fancy words for nothing more than risk transfer. Now, Medicare Part D also wants to look at updating their benefit design and their use of a formulary to address these mid-year or non-annual price increases. Now, a drug company can take a price increase at any time. What Medicare wants to do is lock in the price for the entire year. They want drug prices to provide them a price and lock it in for 12 months so that there's no fluctuation in the federal budget that funds HHS, and to keep those prices stable for beneficiaries. Now, drug companies are pushing back on that because their drug price is based on volume, and their discounts are based on volume, so they would have to assume some risk and do some future projections of that risk in order to be able to create a price point that will take into account fluctuations in volume. That might mean that the drug company might set the price high at the beginning of the year to make up for the fact that they might have a loss later on. That's what happens when you fix a price. You do, in many cases, have to take a higher price up front in order for the other party to provide you with a stable price. That's true of any product. That's just economics 101. So the other issue, there's this flexibility to negotiate. Medicare doesn't have the ability to negotiate drugs for Part B and Part D collectively. So what they're looking at there, and you'll see a couple of other references to this, they want to bundle the products between Part B and Part D and negotiate them at the same time. So if they're buying a product from Merck on Part B at one price and Part D at another price, they want to be able to combine that volume and get the same price frozen for the year. And what they want to do with that is also look at the formularies and determine which of those drugs, which drug companies are willing to give them a fixed price, which of those drugs will actually be on formulary as reimbursable. This is creating a massive debate with them and the drug companies over how pricing works. That's why there's all this conversation going on about price increases. It's because of this. So when the CEO of Pfizer has a conversation with the president about not raising prices, they knew this was coming. They did it to provoke a national dialogue. And the dialogue is occurring behind closed doors. So the other issue is this competitive acquisition program. That's basically taking an RFP that would be sent out by Part B and combining it with an RFP that would be sent out for Part D. Now, this doesn't affect employers. Sorry, guys, I keep hitting the microphone because I'm a Greek and I keep using my hands. I gotta sit on them. But what they want to do is combine those RFPs and, again, do one bulk purchase because they believe, and they probably are right, with the volume combined, they'd get a better price. There are some other policies in here. So there's this one bullet, 3 bullets from the bottom, that has to do with global freeloading. What I said earlier about research and development, what I didn't point out there is that all of it's done in the United States. We fund it as an American society. European countries don't pay anything for R&D, neither do countries in Africa or in Asia. But they get lower prices because when a drug company leaves the United States and has to do business in a country in Europe, they have to do what's called a tender, which is an RFP where they bid a price on their product and it has to be accepted by that government. They must bid what's called best price, the lowest price possible, in order to get permission by that country to sell their product in that country. So they go to Germany, and Germany says, we want best price. Of course the prices in those countries are lower than they are in the United States because in order for someone to compete in that country, they have to give them what the government requires. So they go to Canada, they do the same thing, because these are all nationalized healthcare systems. Everywhere in the world has a national healthcare system with the exception of us and Papua New Guinea. The United States is one of the biggest outliers internationally, with regards to not having a national healthcare system. We don't have negotiating leverage like these other countries do. We pay more because we aren't a collective. We don't negotiate the same way, but we also don't force other countries to take on their fair share of R&D dollars. In the trade war, I'm going to regress for a second and tell you what's really going on with these trade wars, because I've actually been involved in some of this as well. These trade wars aren't about the price of cars. They're about the international burden on the investment that's made in this country through American capital for innovation. The trade war has nothing to do with current products on the market. It has to do with the international burden of the capital invested by Americans and American companies in innovation, so that we can create patented, trademarked, copywritten, protected products. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the products that are being sold in some of these international markets where we want to import them because they're lower price have the same quality as what is manufactured here? No, they don't. The United Nations, a very independent group to the pharmaceutical industry, actually conducted a study, and they found that 11% of the products manufactured outside the United States were counterfeit. I've seen some of these plants. I travel all over the world. I can tell you the manufacturing quality is not the same. The FDA, as much as we criticize them, does a phenomenal job of protecting American patient safety. Phenomenal job in comparison to other countries. So when we talk about importation, when I talk to people who argue with me about importing drugs, I look at them and I go, come with me to these other countries one day, just one day. I want to show you something, because I've seen it with my own eyes. I wouldn't trust that one in every 10 pills that I may be prescribed isn't a pill. It's a placebo or a sugar pill, or it's made of such poor quality that it melts in my hand, or there's no enteric coating on it because we had to make it for pennies on the dollar. The guidelines for manufacturing are such that you don't have to have 100% of the active ingredient in the product. In fact, you can go as low as 40% and still hit the requirements for formulation, because the formulation of the active ingredient allows the manufacturer to go as low as 40 and as high as 120 on the active ingredient. You don't have to have an enteric coating. An enteric coating is what coats the pill to keep it together so that your body can metabolize it and the acid in your stomach doesn't break it up so much that you just, pee it out. So this stuff is important, because if you're not a biologist or a scientist, you don't understand this. You think this is a commodity that you can just purchase. But let me ask you another question. We can't protect the Louis Vuitton and the Hello Kitty brand on the international level. What makes you think we're going to be able to protect the integrity of a statin? It's an honest question, guys. These are massive corporations with lots of money. The Louis Vuitton company. Think about who I'm talking about right now. This is an international conglomerate that burns their merchandise to keep their prices up. They cannot protect their brand from manufacturing integrity issues on a global level. What makes us think that importing these products is a good thing for the average American? So stop having that argument unless you do your homework. Now, the argument you ought to be having is whether or not these countries ought to pick up the burden for the research and innovation in the first place, because they're not paying a nickel for it. They're freeloading. So that's what President Trump's been talking about, and he's right. Can't believe I said that. Gotta put this back on there before I break it again. So the other thing to keep in mind on this importation issue is what's happening in foreign countries. This wasn't an accident, the way this was included in the proposals here. Certain countries I have visited just recently are changing what they call their intellectual property rules. Those two countries happen to be China and India. Why? Because they have over 1.5 billion people in them, and they know they have a looming healthcare crisis. So what they're trying to do is encourage capital transfer from the United States into their countries of biotechnology companies. They want drug companies to come to them. And they're offering massive incentives for this to happen, and especially China. This debate with China around intellectual property is 100% based on what's happening in the drug industry. It's not in the newspapers, but that's what's driving it. Why? Because China just issued massive reforms around intellectual property in their country and how they would protect biotechnology firms. Now remember who these drug companies are. Most of them are not American companies, guys. They're not headquartered in the United States. They have no obligation to stay here. In fact, most of them are headquartered in Europe, and they're being wooed to come to China. And China's saying to them, we'll build you a biopark. You don't have to pay for it. In fact, we'll pay for the research. We'll give you 100,000 biologists, because we got plenty of people and resources. Come here. Bring your biotech farms here and manufacture for us. Now, if you're a publicly traded company that's headquartered in the United Kingdom, you're looking at this and going, the US, China. Here I have to pay. There, they're going to do it for me. What am I getting in the US? Lots of headaches. What do I get in China? 1.5 billion people for my product. Be careful how we demonize these drug companies. They're publicly traded, and until we want to have a debate, once again, about making this a system that is nationalized and protected, we cannot tell them what to do. The next component has to do with how they set their price. Now, these list prices, as I said earlier, have to do with the costs of this R&D and how they recoup it over time. So when a drug company sets their price, they actually look at what they invested in research and development over the life cycle of their clinical trials, and they have more than one. They may have 10 products in the pipeline and only one actually hits. They can't just write off a loss for the 8 or 9 that failed. They'd go bankrupt. So they have to take all of those capital expenses and roll them into the price of the drug that did succeed. So you're not paying for the development of that one drug. You're paying for the failures of the other 8 that didn't make it. The price of your products include the cost of failure. Someone has to pay for it. We forget that. So what they're talking about here is changing the way we price drugs. And in doing so, they want to see all the incentives that are part of that price, because they know that the drug companies are also in many ways being held hostage on price by third parties, whether those third parties are wholesalers or pharmacy benefit managers. We've created this practice in the United States where we use what are called rebates to get placement on formulary for market access, and it has become a chicken and egg game where both sides are arguing that none of this is really going on, but the evidence does prove that it is. And if the evidence wasn't there, I don't think the administration would be proposing a bill to Congress for it. So there is a couple of things that they're looking at. One is the inclusion of this list price in direct-to-consumer advertising. So there's lots of commercials on TV, but no one actually knows what the price of the product is. The drug companies are actually comfortable sharing the list price. They don't have a problem publishing it. They don't have a problem telling the consumer that this price is $100 for this product. The problem they have is that they can't do it because they're gagged in their contract with their third-party suppliers, whether it's distribution companies like wholesalers or PBMs. They can't talk about the list price because what happens to that list price is it gets manipulated in the value chain and it's increased over time. They also can't talk about the rebates that they give these organizations or the discounts. Now, PBMs argue with me all the time. We pass those rebates on. It's not all of the incentives that you get. There is way more than a rebate in the incentive package from a drug company. And the employers don't know what they've got because there's a gag order in that clause. They can't tell you, or a gag clause in that contract. They can't tell you what's in their contract between the drug company and them. They don't want to tell you because they want you to pay the price they're giving you. Now, I've had this debate about rebates with every PBM in the country, and I keep telling them that's a deflection strategy. You're talking about one component of incentives. I'm talking about the appropriate use of premiums. So let's get that argument accurate. This isn't about what you get in rebates or what you get in fees or what you get paid for your service. This is about whether or not those dollars should have been used for that purpose. That's all it is. Should those dollars have been used for that purpose, or should they have been used for the purpose of buying a product that would benefit a patient? Could we have bought 2 drugs instead of 1? Could we have saved the lives of 2 patients instead of 1 had we been efficiently using the dollars in the system? I believe it's waste. There's profit there. How much profit is appropriate? Now, again, they're publicly traded companies. They're entitled to make whatever profit they want. But HHS is saying, we want to know what those list prices are so that when we do get that price from the payer, we can compare. What did the drug company set the list price at, and what are we paying for it as a consumer? That would automatically collapse all incentives in the system. We would immediately go to what is called a net price. Because you can't have two prices. The consumer environment would completely freak out. They're not going to pay a cash price or an insurance price when the manufacturer is publicly telling them what their list price is. So what they're looking at here is also creating what's called a price dashboard so that consumers can compare. So I talked about cash price versus insurance price. There's a big difference as well between the price paid at the pharmacy if the patient has insurance versus if they were to pay cash. And they're pretty significant differences. But the pharmacists also have gag clauses in their contracts between them and the PBM, and they can't tell the patient that the cash price is lower. So let's get to what happened this week. There are two bills going through Congress, one which is a House bill and the other one which is a Senate bill. And there was an announcement on the 7th of September that both bills have passed, and now they're being reconciled into a single bill, which will go to the president for signature. That bill contains language in it that the pharmacist and the pharmacy no longer can have a gag clause in their contract. That is a massive change to this industry, because now you've empowered every pharmacist in the country to be able to expose the actual price of the drug to the patient at the point of sale. They see it on their computer. They know exactly what the price was, how it was changed, and what the insurance company would pay if it was a PBM. I'm using the term insurance company to mean PBM, and what the cash price would be if they paid cash. So the pharmacist can say, hey, of all the prices in here, if you paid cash, it's only $10. Guess what happens when the average American pays cash? There's no claim. There's nothing to adjudicate. They give me $10, I give them their drug, they go away. You don't know what they just took or what they just bought, but you put them in a high deductible plan. You transferred the risk to them. You said, we want you to pick up $3,000 of your care. Well, okay, fine. I'll pay out of pocket. You don't know what drugs I'm on now. There are trade-offs for everything we do in this business. Be careful what you ask for, because now we've created an environment where you're not going to know what drugs your employees are on. There's no claim. In fact, we are already today, and you probably don't even know this because you don't see it, 40% of drugs purchased at the counter are paid for in cash. You already are missing 40% of the data on your employees today without any of this. You just don't realize it. Why? Because they can go to Walmart and get a generic for $4 a month. They can go to Walgreens and get that same generic for $9.99 for a 90-day supply. Doctor prescribed a drug, they went to Walgreens, they got it for $10, they paid cash. You have no idea that your employees are on that product anymore because there's no claim record. You don't know if they're adherent, you don't know if they're compliant, because you didn't pay for it. That's what we're talking about here. The other thing that they're looking at is evaluating what is called the Affordable Care Act maximum rebate amount. And this has to do with the amount the drug company can actually rebate back to the PBM. They want to evaluate whether or not the practice of rebates should be eliminated altogether. Now, think about what I just said. This bill that was in the House and in the Senate is being reconciled into a single bill that will go to the president for signature. Becomes law. Removing the gag clause between the pharmacist and the PBM is the single most powerful lever this administration could have used to reform the industry. Even if they do nothing else, they created immediate transparency around drug price. Immediate. This has massive ripple effects. So when people say to me, this isn't going to happen, it's not going to pass, no, it's already happened, already passed. So do you guys know what the OIG is, the Office of the Inspector General? You know what they do? Anybody know what they do? They're an investigative agency. You know what the CBO is, the Congressional Budget Office. They're a fiscal agency. It's their responsibility to look at the costs of something. They're both bipartisan agencies. They're not Republican or Democrat. They are by law required to be bipartisan. Both of these agencies have evaluated the provisions in these bills and found them to be sound and are supportive. They're so supportive that they've actually submitted a budget request to the Appropriations Committee of Congress. The Appropriations Committee is the committee of Congress that decides how much money to give to an agency to execute on its mandate. This has already happened, folks. So if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your legislative environment, time to start listening, because it's a massive change, and it is moving forward. Now, the other thing that's happening here is another provision of price, which gets a lot of criticism and is probably not on your radar, but you probably don't realize you're paying for it, and that has to do with 340B. 340B is a program that was instituted actually many, many, many years ago. It's been around for decades, but up until recently hadn't been used in the way it's been used. And that has to do with how hospital pharmacies can actually purchase drugs and at what price. They used to be able to get it at a significantly lower price than any other purchaser in the market. And what they were doing is they were using what is called price spreading. It's kind of what PBMs do with price. They price spread. And they keep the difference between what they purchased the drug at and what they resold the drug at. That becomes a profit to them. And for the most part, the federal government allowed them to do this because it was helping hospitals that were community-based or safety net hospitals make up some of their losses because of low Medicaid reimbursement, where they might be on the verge of bankruptcy. So they were allowing them to keep some of this profit, but what started happening was these big academic medical centers, which were not unprofitable, academic medical centers have billions of dollars of endowment. They're not poor. But they were like, hey, we're hospitals too. We qualify to be able to be in this program, so we'll start a 340B hospital pharmacy. We'll do the same thing and we'll keep those profits. Well, the government got wind of this and said, what are you guys doing with all this money? Well, some of them did some stupid things like pay bonuses to their CEO. That's not what the money was meant for. It was supposed to be earmarked for vulnerable populations, which means people on Medicaid or dual eligibles. And they were supposed to be serving in a minimum 11% of their book of business had to be vulnerable populations in order to even qualify. So you had a whole bunch of organizations out there that weren't meeting the qualification standards, that were precipitating 340B prescriptions, keeping the profit, building buildings, paying their CEO. So the abuses got so bad that the federal government intervened, started investigating. The OIG comes in, starts doing investigations, and realized this thing's out of control. So one of the provisions here is to stop the growth of the program, change the eligibility criteria because they believe it's too broad, and stop what is called the duplicate discounting, because they get this Medicaid block grant and a drug rebate, plus they get the 340B spread pricing. So there's a whole bunch of gamesmanship going on with hospitals too. Not just PBMs that are bad actors in this. It's not just drug companies that are bad actors in this. It's hospitals too. And we don't talk about them, but they're perpetuating it just as badly because we have used the drug industry as a means to make money. And there's lots of profit in it. And who suffers from this? The average American. One of my good friends, Dr. Bruce Sherman at Wake Forest University, did a study on income inequality in the United States, totally unrelated to healthcare. He's just a researcher. And he found that 40% of working Americans make less than $40,000 a year. I love this because it's 444. 40% of Americans make less than $40,000 a year. 40% of Americans have less than $400 in the bank. This was published in the newspapers. It was in the Wall Street Journal. It was in the USA Today. It was national headlines. If you didn't read it, shame on you. Shame on you, really. Because these are people who work for you. They have $400 in the bank, and we are giving them $3,000 deductibles to pay for drugs that cost thousands of dollars. And then we want control over everything they do. And we don't like the fact that they're going to pay cash because we now no longer know what prescriptions they've been given and what they bought at Walgreens. What you're going to pay for, it's none of your damn business. The American public has been disadvantaged for too long, and social media is their friend. And all of this started because of a grassroots effort by a woman who was paying for her medication out of pocket at a CVS and discovered that she had overpaid out of her own pocket $15,000 a year for a product that she could have gotten significantly less expensively, and she stopped therapy. Of course, it was a cancer drug. So she sued her employer, and she sued CVS, and it has made it to a federal court, has not been adjudicated by the judicial system yet, but this is where it's headed. So if we think about what's actually happening here and who is paying the price for all of these games, it's your employees, folks. It's the average American patient who is sick. They take medication for a reason. Nobody wants to take drugs. So what HHS is trying to do here is improve transparency of these prices and these rebate practices and where these dollars go, because guess where they come from in the first place? Where'd the money come from? Premiums, right? And where'd the premiums come from? People's payroll deductions. So we are in effect perpetuating poverty by taking money out of people's paychecks to pay for health care and using it ineffectively and inefficiently to help companies profit while we bankrupt the average American. We have wage stagnation in this country, not because of economic policy, but because of healthcare policy. And there's finally studies out there that are proving it. So what HHS would like to do is, at least for where they have authority on Medicare Part D, they would like to prohibit plans from using these gag clauses to prohibit pharmacists from telling employees or Medicare beneficiaries that there's a cheaper alternative. This is the bill that's been passed. And then require Part D plan sponsors to provide more information about those increases. They're going to require MA PDP plans, Medicare Advantage PDP plans, to proactively educate people on drug pricing and alternatives for patients. That's about as far as they can go, but this is what's interesting, and this is what's still open for public comment. They also want, they've sent out an RFI and they've asked for public commentary around whether or not there should be an end-of-year statement that's issued to the federal government by all parties that they negotiate with that disclose what rebates were actually collected and paid. They want a federal preemption of these gag clauses, and that includes employers who are self-funded and fully insured. So this is the provision that hasn't yet passed. It's open for comment. And then increasing information around cost sharing, because Medicare's got that donut hole, remember? So they also have the same burden as people on high deductible plans. And senior citizens on average make $1,200 a month from Social Security, and 75% of them live on only Social Security. So you have a situation where we have poverty level in Social Security already. In the meantime, we've got all these large corporations with CEOs that walk away with $100 million compensation packages. Is it fair? So what happened when these things were announced? Wall Street thought it was great. They started buying up stock in the companies that were being attacked. This is how out of touch the average Wall Street analyst is, guys. They thought this was a good thing for PBMs and insurance companies. These are investors. This is how bright they are. This was May. I don't have the chart that shows today, but it went like this. And then they went, oh, like that. Sorry, we didn't read the detail. Why? Because the average American doesn't pay attention to details. No one wants to do their homework anymore. They don't want to understand these things. Now, you guys came today because you were curious. You came to this session because you wanted to learn. You wanted to be educated. How many of you are out there that don't know and don't care? Because this is where we get our news. We rely on all of this to tell us what to believe. And a lot of Americans didn't even understand what Trump was trying to do. Now, I'm not up here to defend Trump. Believe me, I'm not up here to defend the president. What I am up here to talk about is whether or not these practices are appropriate use of patient money. I'm going to say it again. Whether or not the current model makes appropriate use of people's money. That is what I'm questioning. And you can also see that a lot of people didn't think there were enough specifics in the plan. But when they were polled and asked if they actually read the legislation, less than 1% had actually read the bill. Less than 1% actually downloaded The language, which is publicly available, by the way. This is a government agency. You can pull it down and read it. It's not that bad. The Affordable Care Act was 1,600 pages of legislation. This is not 1,600 pages. There's a 40-page summary you can read for yourself. There's an open commentary RFI out there, so if you'd like to leave comments for Congress, and I completely urge you to be active participants in our political system, because too many of us are passive and don't pay attention to what's going on. There's an open commentary period that goes through the end of September on some of the provisions that will affect self-insured employers, so you should be paying attention. And if you haven't already talked about this as a coalition, your coalition is your best resource for coming to the table with a collective voice. I do these pro bono. This is not my day job. I'm an accountant. I don't do this for a living at all. I do this because it's a personal passion, and I come to these coalition meetings to talk to audiences like yours because I was in the industry for a very long time, and I watched the passivity and what I believed was almost like a paralysis from the employer community about doing anything different. And I come from a generation where employers were being innovative. They were introducing all kinds of cool things in healthcare. And I go back to the 80s. I haven't seen that in the last 10 years, and I don't know what happened. So I would leave you with these parting words. If you don't do it, someone's gonna make you do it because it's your fiduciary duty. And you may have heard me speak about this term fiduciary in the past. You have a duty as an employer. You don't just get to take people's money out of their paycheck and use it at your discretion without being held accountable. And some states are actually coming forward and asking who should be this fiduciary. The employers are saying, it's the PBM. Okay, well, some states have said, we will legislate that. We will make the PBM a fiduciary. Some states have said, no, we'll make the employer the fiduciary. Now, do you really want this to continue? Do you want all 50 states to have different rules? Because guess what? If you're a national company, you're going to have to comply with all 50 of them. So you best get on board with a national agenda, or the states will do it for you because they have Medicaid plans that they're trying to protect, and that's why they're legislating this, because their Medicaid programs are in PBM programs. And they're an employer too. In fact, some of the states are actually suing PBMs for their practices. They're suing drug companies. Have you guys heard of the Rockford lawsuit in Rockford, Illinois, against the opioid manufacturers? Because they paid so much money in opioids. We don't make change in this country because of changes in the law. We make change in this country because of what a courtroom says. We don't want it to go there because you will be dragged into it. And CFOs and HR executives are denying that they have any responsibility here. They're like, it's not our problem. And I don't know if you guys know David Chase, but he's also pretty controversial. He's written a bunch of books on healthcare reform. I actually really, really respect Dave because he does his homework. And what he's saying here is that this is a dereliction of duties. Now, you may dismiss his article, but guess what? Do you guys know what a law firm is? If you're a plaintiff attorney, you see this and you go, woohoo, I got a class action lawsuit. Hey, the tobacco industry was great. I'm gonna take on the employer's plan sponsors because guess what? They haven't done jack in 10 years, maybe 20. This is awesome. These are big corporations I can go after. They have deep pockets. And guess who they're gonna ask for subpoena? The benefit directors, because you're the gatekeepers. So don't look at me like I'm the bad messenger here. I'm just delivering a presentation, and I hope that you take what I've said to heart. Work with your coalitions. Come together in a common collective voice. Stand together as an organized group of employers and stop abdicating your power to the corporations. They're using you, and they're using your employees' money, and you have a bigger responsibility with fiduciary duty. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you, Alex. We have time for a few questions. Please make your way to the microphones there and there to ask your questions.
What are 2 or 3 or 4 things that we can do to start? First of all, you got to get educated. You got to find out what's in this bill. This is a good resource, but it's not the only resource. Read it. Ask questions. If you have an ERISA attorney, talk to them. Talk to your own general counsel about what your liability might be here. You gotta start with your homework. That's the first thing. The second thing is talk to each other. As I said before, I'm gonna put a plug in for the coalitions because they're here as a resource to you, and I've seen the membership dwindle year after year after year, and it's counterintuitive to me. At a time when you guys should be working together, you're more further apart. You have resources available to you to help you create collective responses. The second thing you ought to be doing is not only leveraging those resources, but working with them to evaluate what the pending regulations are and preparing responses to the open RFIs. This is a public discourse with a federal agency. You have the opportunity and the obligation to be a voice of your employees. Have an opinion on it, come to consensus, and respond, or they will change the legislation and you will be victims of it. The third thing you can do is talk to your vendors or your partners and ask them what they're doing to prepare and how they're going to help you prepare. You pay them to serve you, not the other way around. I can't tell you how many employers tell me they're afraid of their PBMs. That's ridiculous. It is ridiculous to me that you're afraid of someone you pay for a service. Or you're afraid of your consultants. God, I wish my clients were afraid of me. They beat the crap out of me. But I'm an accountant. It's a whole different, they don't want to hear what I have to say. But you have resources available to you. If you're spending your time worrying about day-to-day operations, you're not doing your job. This stuff is too important for you not to be paying attention. You will lose your job if you don't pay attention to it. It is the single largest piece of legislation we've seen since the Affordable Care Act. And that was 10 years ago. And it's just beginning. As I said, this is just drugs. Wait till they get to the hospitals. It's only going to get harder for you if you're not on top of it and in front of it. So those three things are my piece of advice. Do your homework, work with your coalition partners and each other, and talk to your vendors, and come up with a game plan. You guys have got to do something beyond transferring risk to your employees and increasing deductibles year after year after year. They can't afford them. So you got to do something different. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Alex, thank you. Well, you'll be hearing more about our health policy work a little later on this morning, but we're motivated.
Oh, good.
Alex, thank you. Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Excellent. We are going to move right into the business meeting portion of our morning. So Larry, do you want to come up and get us started, please?
Okay, tough act to follow, Alex. Well done. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Larry Pribble, Alliance Board Vice Chair. I'm pleased that you are here to mark our 28th year as a cooperative of employers working together to move healthcare forward. Now, as our first order of business, we are required to approve the minutes of the 2017 annual meeting. And you'll find those minutes in the brochures on the table. So without expecting everybody to go read them again, do I have a motion to approve the minutes? Thank you. Do I have a second? Thank you again. Any discussion on the minutes? Okay, if that no discussion, we'll move to a vote. All in favor of approving the minutes? Anybody opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. Now, our cooperative continues to attract new members who want the combination of control, choice, and cost savings offered by self-funding with the Alliance. We have 29 new members that joined in our fiscal year 2018, which ended on May 31st. With these, the Alliance currently has 245 members. Now, what you're seeing up there is the new members that joined us in fiscal 2018. Now, somebody just flipped ahead for me. What you are currently seeing are 5 brand new members who joined us since June 1st. And again, welcome the new members. Now, another part of the business is I'm pleased to announce that we have 5 board members that have been reelected to an additional 3 years of term. They are Annette McCullough, Brad Olm, Shirley Reef, Mick Grunwald, and Wendy Culver. If Annette, Brad, Shirley, and Mick, if you're here, if you could stand up. Now, unfortunately, Wendy Culver is not able to make this, but she will be here for our meeting later this afternoon. So again, thank you so much for your years of service and the additional years ahead. Now, these 5 people join a group of 4 other volunteer members to make up the board of directors. If you currently serve on the board, I'd ask you to please stand at this time so we can recognize your service. Okay. Thank you to all our board members, current and past, for your willingness to volunteer your time to serve our cooperative. Now, as your Alliance board chair, I'd like to take a moment and talk about our focus on giving you Alliance answers for your health benefit challenges. We all have big questions about health care and health benefits. And a few of these are, how can I encourage employees to get the care they need and avoid the care that they don't need? Another is, what is the key to restraining health benefit costs while still recruiting the right people for our firms? And how do we remain competitive with that? And one of my favorites, why does healthcare cost so much, and why is that cost so much more at Hospital A than Hospital B? Well, as a member of the Alliance Cooperative, you can rely on getting Alliance answers to your health benefit questions. In doing so, we put our health benefit experts to work on the issues that impact your plan and your costs. We use the data that we have to offer insights on healthcare prices, usage, and other cost drivers. We seek out opportunities to move healthcare marketplace forward to higher value healthcare. And we expand our network geographically to meet your needs as well as the needs of employers located on the outer edge of our service area. And lastly, as you have seen today, we give you access to national and regional experts for their insights and tactics on the pressing problems and emergent challenges. So offering Alliance answers means we continually aim to answer your pressing questions about healthcare benefits and effective healthcare purchase strategies. So that's my little spiel about Alliance Answers. And now I would like to introduce Paul Meyer, Alliance Chief Operating Officer, who also serves as our board treasurer. Paul will come up and hit a subject that I love since I'm a CEO and give us all an invigorating overview of the Alliance's financial condition. Paul?
What's the definition of invigorating? You? Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Larry. I appreciate it. I'm pleased once again to be here to give you the Treasurer's Report. I've been doing this for a number of years. Before I get to my prepared comments, though, I want to just take a second to remind everybody how we are organized. The Alliance is organized as a cooperative. Our formal name is the Employer Healthcare Alliance Cooperative. So I wanted to spend a second on what it means to be a cooperative. So we're organized and recognized as a cooperative by the IRS, the state of Wisconsin, and the other states in which we have business. As a cooperative, when members, companies join the Alliance, they become owners of the cooperative. So really, if you're an employer here today, I'm giving you a report as the treasurer of a company that you own. Okay, so you want to listen up. We are a not-for-profit cooperative. Any net proceeds, which is the difference between what we take in and our expenses, is earmarked to our members at the end of the year. And so I'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Cooperative structure helps to ensure that we're focused on serving our members. As you heard Alex talk about, it is that collective power that we're trying to leverage on your behalf. This is a really important distinction in our market where, for example, providers deal with many outside organizations, many of which are for-profit behemoths headquartered far, far away. The providers know that when they're dealing with the alliance, they're dealing with the local employers, unencumbered by mixed incentives. We work for you, and we work for you alone. So this is a unique characteristic of being organized as a cooperative. So the Alliance generates value for its members in many ways. Shared learning, like today, the Quality Path program that we have, group purchase services, preferred partners like National Cooperative RX, Delta Dental, the other many partners that we have here in the room. But the number one reason that employers join the Alliance is the savings we generate by group purchasing healthcare from providers as a group. This represents clout in the market. Got ahead of myself. So this graph shows the total amount billed by providers, hospitals, and clinics, and the repriced amounts, which is the amount that we negotiate on your behalf. It's showing a steady increase over the years to approximately $700 million or so in FY17 and 18. What you'll see is a slight dip in FY17. I want to just spend a second on this. I talked a little bit about this last year and I'd like to hit it again. We experienced the loss of our largest member, WEA Insurance Trust. They represented about 14% of our business. WEA was a member of the Alliance since 2000. They decided to join the Alliance back when they had almost all of the school districts in the state as part of their insurance trust. As we all know, the market has changed significantly since then. We have the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, provider and payer consolidation, and in WEA's case, the passage of Act 10 and the associated loss of school districts utilizing WEA. In response, WEA reassessed their business model and made a number of changes, some of which resulted in us becoming competitors for some market segments. The trust concluded that they should establish their own provider contracts in this region, which is similar to how they purchase healthcare services in other parts of the state. So for that reason, they left the Alliance. I want to assure you that WEA and the Alliance continue to work together on issues of common interest, such as advocating for increased cost and increased transparency in the market. So we see a reduction over the last 2 fiscal years because the termination was effective in the middle of fiscal year FY17. Outside of that loss, and you would notice here that this is not a loss of 14%. We were growing at the same time, so we have the slight dip caused by the loss of WEA while we're increasing in membership. Okay. I want to assure you, too, that at $700 million, we represent enough clout to get providers' attention in the market and represent your interests. So the next couple graphs show how the Alliance is doing as a going concern. This slide shows the revenue and expenses by fiscal year for the last 10 years. The tall bar is the revenue. The next bar is expense. We like to see that relationship, which leaves the net proceeds for the organization. You can see that revenue bumped up to about $7.4 million in FY18, primarily the result of the member growth that I talked about earlier. The slight dip in FY17, again, related to the loss of WEA. The bump over the last years in the expense side of things, primarily related to filling some key open positions and making further investments in quality path and in geographic expansion. Just a mention about the net proceeds. Most of the net proceeds are returned to members in the form of cash or allocated equity. This is part of being a co-op. In the co-op world, this is called patronage. Each year, along with our board, We consider future financial needs, determine how much of the net income to retain as allocated equity, and how much to return in the form of cash. This year, the board made the decision to return 20% of the patronage in cash and 80% remaining on our books as allocated equity, with plans to put those monies towards ensuring we have a healthy reserve. For those employer members in the room, you or a representative from your company has received or will receive shortly, and I actually witnessed this this morning, receiving a check to your company that represents your cash portion of the patronage for fiscal year 18. This graph is based on our balance sheet. It's a snapshot in time of our books as of the end of the fiscal year, which is May 31st. It shows total assets, liabilities, and the difference, which is equity. We could tease out a lot of things from this graph, but the main point is that we have a very healthy financial position. Assets significantly greater than liabilities. We carry no debt. Assets are growing because we had solid financial performance, and we took steps to build our reserves. This is probably a good time to mention that our board hires an audit firm each year to audit our financials. And like all other years, we received a clean bill of health for FY18. We got assurances that our record keeping is top notch. And the auditors typically will comment on the strength of our balance sheet. So we're in good shape. So value of membership. I mentioned earlier there are many benefits to membership in the Alliance. Many of those benefits are very hard to quantify. However, we've pulled together what we can about the hard dollar return that's generated through membership in the Alliance. This graph shows the ROI, or at least our definition of it. It indicates that the ROI you experienced by being a member of the Alliance was about $39.73 in FY18. This is calculated by taking the savings from the provider contracts, dividing it by the average number of employees, by the cost of running the Alliance. And so another way to interpret this is that for every dollar that is spent on membership in the Alliance, $39.73 is generated in savings. It's a solid ROI. The trend is down somewhat over the last several years due to the loss of WEA, but also this measure does not take into account the other things that we are doing to work on your behalf. So we may make investments in technology that can help us to address utilization. The best way for us to control costs is not to incur any cost in the first place. And so we're trying to take a look at areas where you are experiencing higher utilization and starting to consider, and have been considering, things that you can do about it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. So this graph, to me, reinforces that we're a cooperative. It shows the decline in our retainage rate. Let me explain what this is. Retainage is our term for the share of claim savings that is retained by the Alliance. So for example, if there's a claim for $300, we save $100, and the retainage rate, which is right now 2.6%, out of that $100 savings, we retain $2.60 to fund our business. A big component of our price is the retainage rate. This graph shows that we've consistently reduced this price from 32% in 1991, where we kept 32 cents of every dollar that was saved through our contracts, down to now at 2.6%. If we were a for-profit, we would not be taking the steps that we are to drive this down. Our objective is if we can provide a solid, stellar service for you all, and we can do it at a reasonable price, we will do what we can to drive down our costs to do that on your behalf. And we have done it. This is my last slide. This is where the rubber meets the road. This graph shows the medical claims costs after our contract rates are applied, associated with providing care to employees enrolled in an Alliance-affiliated plan. It's calculated by taking all of the claims received for hospital, clinic, and ancillary services, applying our contracted rates to get a net amount, and then dividing it by the average number of employees enrolled in an Alliance-affiliated plan. Now, we could spend an entire day talking about cost drivers and why this is doing what it's doing, and time's not going to allow for it. Our goal is to help you manage this cost and to work with our members to drive this cost down. You can see that in FY18, we had an increase of 4.7% in the healthcare costs per employee per year. The increase can be broken down into price increase and utilization increase. So how much we pay per unit versus how many units we're using. The price increase, or what we're paying per unit of service, which really is what the Alliance has more control over contracting on your behalf, was 1.5% of the 4.7% increase, or about a third of the price increase. I'm sorry, a third of the increase. The remainder was due to utilization increases. This is the area that we can all work to address, and things that we will be working on and continue to work on your behalf, but there are many things that you can do as well. This can be done through better preventive care, and I'm just give a couple examples. Better preventive care, enhanced care management, in sending patients to use high-value providers. These are just a few of the tactics that we can be considering, and we will be considering. So I just want to reinforce that our goal is to drive this cost down. This is the most important one. So that's really all I have for prepared comments. To summarize, we had as a business another strong fiscal year. Our balance sheet remains strong, and we continue to bring value to our members. Any questions? Come on, Larry. Stump me. Now he will. Thank you very much for your time, and turn it back over to Cheryl.
Good morning. I just want to make a few remarks from my role as the CEO. Over the course of this last year, our board and senior team took the step of developing a vision statement for the Alliance. We have always had a strong mission statement to work together to control costs and improve quality and engage individuals in their health. But given the magnitude of change that's taking place in the healthcare industry and in this market, we felt like it was a good time to create a vision statement, to really get clear and create a vivid picture of the future that we're trying to create through the work of the Alliance. I will not do justice this morning to the richness of those conversations and sometimes debates that took place as we were working on this statement, but I'm excited to share it with you this morning. We're working toward a future where high-quality, affordable health care is reliably delivered to all patients. And this to us means the total cost of care, not just the portion that employers are paying, but the total cost for our employees as well as for us. It also recognizes that we can have both lower cost and better quality care. This is not impossible. In fact, it's quite doable, and we intend to ensure that it happens. We also envision a future where people have confidence that their health plans enable them to take care of themselves and their family members. And isn't this what this really is all about? At the end of the day, don't we all want to know that we can provide the health care, that we can get the health care that our family members and we need without the risk of personal bankruptcy? And finally, we envision a future where Alliance members thrive by joining together to control the trend of healthcare costs. We know what's possible by working together, and we intend to create a positive and lasting impact on healthcare, and at the same time, create a competitive advantage for our members. So with a clear vision, now the fun begins. We will now begin working toward the strategies, the how, to make our vision a reality. We'll be focusing on high-value primary care And that's part of what the video work is about this morning. We'll be expanding our provider network to extend the reach of the Alliance to more communities while we transition also to new ways to pay for health care that reward results and efficiency, not just more care. We'll also be providing our members with information and support to both move market share to high-value providers, as well as to identify potential high healthcare costs before they occur so that they can be prevented or managed. Finally, we will be uniting and amplifying your voice on health policy issues of importance to employers and their employees, which is why Alex's comments this morning were so timely. And we have a great opportunity to do just that at the end of this month. The Alliance has been invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Health Committee that is studying ways to control healthcare costs. They've been holding a series of hearings over the summer and fall with the goal of understanding not only what are driving healthcare costs, but also ways to control them. Administrative waste, inappropriate care, and the hearing where we will be testifying focuses on the important role of innovation in controlling healthcare costs. That hearing will take place on September 27th, and we're excited to share not only the stories of the Alliance, but importantly, the work that our members have done to really drive down healthcare costs and improve the health of their employees. So speaking with one voice is the reason why we established our health policy function almost a decade ago. And I remember the conversation with the board when we did so. What we said was, we're either at the table or we're on the menu. And so we're at the table. And the Health Policy Committee and the platform and the resolutions that you've recently passed are an important part in helping us represent your voice with confidence. So now I'd like to introduce Karen Timberlake from Michael Best Strategies. The Michael Best Strategies team provides us with excellent guidance and support in this area, and Karen will be talking more about the resolutions we just approved and how you can get more involved. Karen?
Good morning, everybody. It's the coveted right before break speaking spot. So I will be talking more, but not at great length, about these resolutions and the health policy function and how you all can get more involved. First job is to move the clicker. So here's our fantastic health policy committee. Lisa Henke's name is written in invisible ink. So if you look closely, you will see it. Lisa, our apologies, but it's there. So thank you to Pam and Vicki and Wendy and Lisa and Paula and Jerry and Wendy for being just an outstanding committee. As you can see, we've got membership from Wisconsin and Illinois, which we think is very important, and we are always in the market for new members. So do let us know and let Cheryl know if this is something you'd be interested in helping out with. As Cheryl mentioned, we have a team at Michael Best that is spread across actually now 5 states and Washington, D.C. 2 of the states that we are in are Wisconsin and Illinois, and we also have colleagues out in DC. So we are watching policy-related developments for you, health policy-related developments for you in both states and at the federal level. Part of what we have spent a good bit of time on this year with our Health Policy Committee and with guidance from Cheryl and other leaders at the Alliance is to think through a set of health policy resolutions. And I know that you studied them in great detail before you cast a vote to support them, so thank you for that. What I do want to do just in a couple of quick minutes, though, is to explain a little bit more about the so what and the now what of these resolutions. And again, I completely concur with Cheryl that Alex's remarks were a great setup for how important it is for employers and for employer coalitions to get involved and stay involved in the health policy making process. By that, we really want to underscore that health policy making happens at both the state and federal level. Even though you are self-funded employers, there are things that happen at the state level with state Medicaid programs, with state regulation of healthcare data and transparency, with state employee health benefit programs. All of those things and many more affect the overall healthcare landscape in ways that affect you and your goals and what you're trying to get done. So we follow all that stuff for you, and we think it's important that you continue to get involved and make your voices heard even in those state level conversations. Similarly, at the federal level, as you heard, sometimes we're talking about acts of Congress, sometimes we're talking about executive action that the president, him or herself, can take, or that a federal agency can take. Sometimes we're talking about rulemaking processes, which are very long and complex and often allow for comments and perspectives to be offered. Sometimes we're talking about invited testimony of important thought leaders in the overall health policy arena. All of those things matter. All of those things are a chance to have your voice heard. So without belaboring the resolutions, there are 8 new resolutions that have been adopted. All I'm going to do quickly is touch on really the bolded text on each slide so that you have a sense of what these 8 topics are. So under the broad platform plank of cost and quality transparency, the first new resolution we adopted, very timely again, has to do with promoting fair market prices for prescription drugs to ensure appropriate care and predictable healthcare expenses. And there's a long list of ways that policymakers can support that overall objective, many of which were touched on in Alex's remarks. So I won't go into those in greater detail. You'll have an opportunity, again, to sort of study the resolutions more fully. The second, moving now to the second platform plank of the overall health policy platform, is to build out our thinking on what it means to align incentives for providers and to really promote payment mechanisms that will drive better value in healthcare. One of the primary ways that we believe and that the Alliance believes we can get that done is by making more data about cost and quality and services that were delivered and the results that were achieved. More data available not just to employer purchasers, although we think that's important, but more data on healthcare services, cost and quality and outcomes available to everyone in the healthcare ecosystem so that there can be this common understanding of what's going on, where there may be gaps, where there may be opportunities for improvement. Next, we have a resolution related to promoting policies that reduce opioid misuse and addiction. Obviously, this is among the great public health challenges of our time. It's also an area which, if you're following it in either state, you're seeing that it's an area of intense legislative interest and intense legislative activity. And the Alliance wants to make it known that the Alliance overall supports policies that will control opioid misuse, will hold providers and others accountable if they are in violation of those policies. And again, you see the reference to information sharing and transparency as a key way to create accountability in this very diverse and complex issue area. Next in the platform is a plank around supporting consumers, to Cheryl's point about really making sure people can get the care that they need for themselves and their families. So one of the ways that we believe, that the Alliance believes that can happen, is by really supporting and promoting telemedicine. So here, why is this in a health policy platform? It's in a health policy platform because we want to make sure that we have consistent policies as much as possible across the various markets where Alliance members operate. And we want to make sure that there aren't regulatory barriers put in place that would make telemedicine services harder to get, more expensive, subject to additional regulatory hoops. In addition, and speaking of the theme of high-value primary care, we have now a resolution related to supporting brief screening and intervention services for very common behavioral health conditions. So obviously a lot of the focus still is around the opioid epidemic and the opioid challenge, but all of you know that alcohol is also a significant problem. There are other kinds of addictive behaviors that show up in the workplace, make it harder for people to do their jobs. And there is a wonderful set of evidence-based strategies, very simple screening, very simple on-site counseling and brief intervention that has dramatic effects for people who have problematic use, but perhaps not all the way to deep, deep end addiction. So here's a case where there can be both government policies at the legislative level that can make it easier or harder for these kinds of services to be adopted, but this is also a great example in state Medicaid programs and in state employee health benefit programs, where just through administrative action, the state governments in particular, and the federal government as well, can make it more possible for these services to be offered. And as those government purchasers of healthcare get in the game on some things that the Alliance thinks is important, that means the provider community is more aligned that way. That makes it easier for you all to get what you want as far as services for your own employees and their family members. Again, under the theme of supporting consumers, we didn't want to speak only to the opioid crisis without also speaking to evidence-based pain management, because we understand that as there is a reduction in opioid prescribing, we don't want to leave people with no ability to manage chronic pain. And so in the resolution, there's actually a much longer list of what those evidence-based pain management strategies are. And again, it's a case of looking to see that plan designs align with this, looking to see that payment methodology aligns, looking to see that quality measurement and transparent reporting of outcomes all are in alignment with this overall vision that the Alliance has. Then the final platform plank has to do with the healthcare marketplace. And here we mean marketplace globally. So healthcare ecosystem, so partly the individual Affordable Care Act marketplace, because obviously, again, that's a segment of the population that doesn't directly affect you all, but does affect the overall provider community. But we also mean the broader topic of how healthcare services are purchased. I have to tell you that this resolution, ensuring that healthcare acquisitions and service expansions promote value, was among the most difficult for us to sort of grapple with as a health policy committee, to figure out what we could say about it that would make a difference, quite honestly, because we recognize that in a private sector-driven healthcare economy, providers are making expansion decisions, lenders are making financing decisions, all of you are making kind of service acquisition decisions, and the Alliance with you in terms of what providers go in the network. And there's no cut and dried answer to what's right and what's wrong about a new hospital here, a new clinic there, a new set of services on this corner and not on that corner. So what this resolution calls for is for those kinds of decisions to be motivated by a more comprehensive look at what's really driving demographics, what's really driving need for services, where could there be an investment in more preventive services instead of more acute services, and where different states approach this differently, different communities even approach this differently. So where there is some amount of public sector oversight and engagement in a discussion about healthcare service expansion, employers should be at the table. Employers' voices should be sought out, and employers should be asked for their points of view. And then finally, the last new resolution has to do with reforming the workers' compensation system, specifically in Wisconsin. So this is a case where there are some differences between the Illinois workers' comp program and the Wisconsin workers' comp program, and the Alliance remains committed to a high-value workers' compensation program in both states and wants to make sure that it is on the record about both of those things. So to wrap up quickly, and sort of again, the so what and the now what, a couple of requests for you. I know that was a really quick summary. The slides will be available. The full text of the resolutions will be available. If you are thinking about a topic in health policy or something that you're really watching or concerned about that you didn't see covered in that list of resolutions, tell us about it. We've got a link on your evaluation survey that's coming out that will enable you to fill that in and give us some advice. Related to that, we really have a goal with Cheryl's leadership of making these resolutions not just a sort of static, list of guiding principles that we look back at every now and then and say, yep, we still believe that, yep, we still believe that. But instead, for things like Cheryl's testimony at the Senate, for blog posts, for rules that we may or may not choose to comment on, for testimony that, at a state level that we may or may not encourage Cheryl to, or one of you to appear and say something about. We want to make these resolutions living and breathing and really guiding of action. So if you have thoughts for us about how to do that, or perspectives, ideas, suggestions, we're open absolutely to all of that. And then finally, if you'd like to join the fun on the Health Policy Committee, give Cheryl a call or track us down, and we'd be happy to have you. So thanks so much for having us and for allowing us to support you in this really critically important work.
Thanks, everyone. We now are going to take a 10-minute break. So see you back here at 10 minutes after 10. Next up is Cheryl Larson, President and CEO of the Midwest Business Group on Health. MBGH is a sister coalition to the Alliance, and Cheryl has been a friend and a colleague for many years. Under Cheryl's leadership, MBGH has been working with its employer members to address this issue since 2010. And she leads MBGH's National Employer Initiative on Specialty Drugs, the first major purchaser-driven research project to help employers manage the high cost of biologic and specialty drugs. Please join me in welcoming Cheryl.
Thank you, Darlene. It's not afternoon yet, so I think it's still good morning, right? Okay. Following two really, really strong, great presentations, that's tough. But I'm excited to be here, and I talk really fast already. Plus, I'm going to talk extra fast because I only have 30 minutes, and I'm going to try and save some time so we get back on time a little bit. Let me start by telling you a little bit about who we are, as Cheryl just shared with you. And by the way, Cheryl's one of two other coalition leaders with the name Cheryl, and we spell it the same way, and we're awesome. So we are a little bit different than the Alliance in that we are not heavily involved in purchasing. We represent primarily mid, large, and jumbo self-insured public and private employers. Our board bylaws mandate that 60% of our membership has to be employers. All of our board, with the exception of a few associate members, are employers. We focus on, as a 501c3, education, research. We have a very tiny little purchasing arm. We discovered a long time ago that large self-insured employers want to make purchasing decisions on their own, but they do rely on us to provide them with guidance. So that gives you a little bit of background. This is moving by itself. I'm pretty excited about that. Probably embedded in my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about our National Employer Initiative on Specialty Drugs. When I was here for the opioid program about 8 weeks ago, I talked a little bit about this. It is an employer-driven research project that we started in 2010 when our board told us that they saw that specialty drugs costs were getting really high and they were starting to have a real concern. So we created an advisory council of large self-insured employers that are part of this. We've done 5 or 6 employer benchmarking surveys to kind of gauge where the marketplace is. And through those benchmarking surveys, what we learned in the first several years is that employers had no idea what was going on in this space. They weren't being talked to their PBMs or their consultants about it, and we've certainly seen that change. And in the last couple of years, especially the last year, the media has exploded in information about what's going on, so I think we're all better educated. We created an online employer toolkit to help employers, especially those that maybe didn't have a consulting firm or someone advising them, so that they had a place to go, and I'm going to share some resources on that later. We do an annual employer forum on pharmacy benefits and specialty drugs. Not surprisingly, Alex was our keynote this year. We do a lot of stakeholder meetings. I come to other conferences to talk about what's going on in the marketplace, and we do collaborate with some of our sister coalitions. So when we look at what employers are looking at, we're looking for innovation. We want to pay for innovation. We're willing to pay for innovation from suppliers. I'm talking about the wholesalers, the PBMs, those kinds of groups, and drug manufacturers. But much of the current model is not working, as we know. We want transparency about real costs. We need to stop spending money on low-value drugs. I know that Heather just shared that with us. This will preserve money for us to pay for the high-value drugs, like the specialty drugs that are life-threatening or impact our productivity at work. We want drugs on formulary to be based on clinical efficacy and safety, not on rebates. And if you walk away with one lesson here, and we've heard a lot about rebates. Rebates today in the PBM world are not based on clinical efficacy. They're based on how much that PBM is going to make on that drug. ESI's new 2019 formulary removed a Hep C drug from its formulary because they weren't getting rebates on it. It's one of a handful of manufacturers in the marketplace right now that are bringing drugs to the market at net cost and not paying rebates. Those drugs have a much harder time getting on formulary because the PBMs want the drugs that give them the highest level of rebates. So they remove that drug, which has an equal efficacy level and is significantly less in terms of costs, because they have to make their employer rebate guarantees in the contracts that you guys have signed. So we are contributing to the rebate problem, and we would love to see that change. We also want to see waste removed. You can see that from Heather's presentation, or last slide at the end. Let's get waste out of the specialty drug system. We heard from Cheryl and others that we need to get waste out of the whole system. We see specialty drugs as low-hanging fruit in terms of saving costs and getting better patient outcomes. And so if we can start chipping away at this in small ways, like through specialty drugs and other initiatives, then we can start looking at other areas. What do we know? We know that today employers are the real purchasers, the real payers, I should say, of healthcare benefits. We're covering 56% of all costs according to CMS in the US today. We have no visibility to any of the contracts between any of the entities, or even within our own contracts with suppliers like PBMs. And that is especially true between the handoff between the parties that handle the transport and handoff of the drug. In fact, by the time a drug leaves the manufacturing facility and gets into the hands of the patient, it might have been touched by 10, 20, 30 different entities who have all added to the cost of that drug. Drug prices are marked up at every point, significantly increasing employer costs, and they're even arbitrage. That means there's negotiating between parties. A party will buy it and then resell it to another group. Everybody's making money in this process. And as we talk about the current M&A activity with the health plans, with the PBMs that are going on, and I could name them if anybody doesn't know, but I'm sure you've been following it, it's not going to save us money. The best we can hope for is that we're going to get better care coordination that might improve patient outcomes, but in terms of the cost of care, in terms of the cost of drugs, we're not going to see cost savings, and that makes me sad. So we did hear from Alex today, and Alex and I have been friends for a long time, and we've been talking about the whole fiduciary thing for a long time as well, and I'm concerned that employers are not taking it seriously, and I was proud of her because she really threw a call to action out, but I'm going to say it again. This is what DOL says. DOL says we have to act solely in the interest of our participants and their beneficiaries for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits. We have to carry out our duties prudently and follow the plan documents. We have to hold plan assets, and most importantly, and that's why it's in bold, we have to pay only reasonable plan expenses. Now, if it's true, and I'm careful about where I say this, I always want to put it in an article I'm writing, but I don't, I haven't yet. But if it's true that there are entities in the healthcare and the pharmacy benefit supply chain that are dramatically adding to our costs, that puts us at risk for not paying reasonable plan expenses, that we're paying for waste and some other things. And as Alex talked about, the first major lawsuit, we started talking about this 5-6 years ago, the first major lawsuit that women that settled out of court, that's one example, and I think that's going to continue. So if you haven't talked to your employee benefits consultant, your broker may or may not be able to help you with this. You really need to make sure that you understand what's going on behind the scenes. And I know one of the biggest challenges I face when I work with my members or other employers about finding out if this abuse is taking place, both on the health plan side, are they charging more than they should? On the PBM side, are they charging more than they should? You don't have access to that in the contracts. So at least for the short term, you're covered, but it's going to start to change. As you can see, this is the biggest transparent blanket I've ever seen in the marketplace. Not only do we see it in public, the Me Too movement and some of the other things that are taking place, we're seeing it on the medical side. And it's going to be a train that just keeps going. Employers need to understand what's going on the channels, as the various channels, as Heather talked about, and how the impact of middlemen are adding to the cost of care. So what are progressive employers doing about this? They're driving change, they're being disruptive, and offering alternatives to the traditional model. I'm going to share that in a minute. We as coalitions, Alex already said, really are serving as the voice for employers that don't feel that they have a voice or have much clout in the market to make changes. The PBMs and health plans have really gotten big and strong, and they have figured out a long time ago how to continue to be profitable even in challenging environments. Some of the existing and new strategies we see out there, like JP Morgan Chase, Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, which either goes by ABC or JAB, JAB. I prefer JAB. We still don't know the what. We have ideas to believe it's going to be some direct contracting, it's going to be on-site clinics, it's going to be some other things, but it's going to take us several years before it trickles down to the potential opportunities for us to see if it provides value. Health Transformation Alliance, they struggled a little bit too. They have a few products out there. We were really looking forward to seeing what they did with their pharmacy benefits, and instead of putting out there something transformational, they contracted with two of the major PBMs out there, and the prices are lower, but they're lower because of all of the lives that they brought to the table, the ability to aggregate those lives. That's something we need to do like the Alliance does with its medical benefit right now. Apple and others are doing some things, but we're still kind of taking a wait-and-see attitude. We know that the collaborations that we see out there are going to have to reduce unnecessary costs, low-value care, waste, and abuse in the system, drive efficiencies, and pretty importantly, drive patient outcomes as well. So a few of the opportunities that are available to us in this marketplace, as I said, low-hanging fruit, are looking at our pharmacy benefits. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about some of the other middlemen out there, middle women, whatever, middle people, let's go with that. PBMs, drug wholesalers, and drug distributors. But when you look at how much a PBM is making versus a wholesaler versus a distributor, and I have a chart coming up, you'll see there's a significant difference in what they're making. PBMs currently today are not regulated, and I think about the pharmaceutical manufacturer industry. They are so heavily regulated. Health plans are somewhat regulated. PBMs do not have to regulate at all. So I think when the government was looking at all of the things, they saw these as being the most egregious that we talked about in terms of the gag clauses and the copay clawbacks and some of the other things I'll mention later. But they also recognized that it was low-hanging fruit, that they could do something about it, that you as employers could do something about this. So we want to know how they function, what deals do they cut, how do they generate revenue, what services they perform. And you may, as an employer, already know what that is, but have you ever gone to your PBM and said, I want to change our contract, or I want to add this to the contract, or I want to change these services, and they've turned back with you and just said, no, we're not willing to do that. I'm going to share some resources with you, some checklists and tip sheets that 5-6 years ago, when we launched them, some of our members went to their PBMs and said, we'd like to make these changes. And PBMs said no. And you know, when we hear about employers being afraid of PBMs, they are. But we need to be willing to walk away, and we're often afraid of disruption. So, and we've heard a lot about a lot of these things today, but we need to be willing to walk away and look at what other services are available. I know you guys have access to the National Cooperative, RX Cooperative, which is awesome, but not every employer in this country knows what to do in these cases. We already know who the 3 big PBMs are that are managing the majority of the money in this space. We already know that contracts are opaque. We know that M&A activity is occurring. So we have to take all of that into consideration as we're looking at this. Adam Fine from Drug Channels, he's a blogger. He's got drugchannels.com. He's an expert in this area. If you have never seen any of his stuff, take a look at his website, drugchannels.com, I believe. He has these great infographics, and this kind of tells you what the costs are on the plan sponsor and patient side versus the system side, the delivery system side. And we see that of all of the entities out there making money, pharmacy benefit managers are making the most. And they're not really providing a lot of a service for that. In fact, if we look at, and I'm not just blaming them, I don't see a lot of activities related to adherence these days. I remember 20 years ago in the industry, everybody was focused on adherence. I don't see a lot of that anymore. But the pharmacy makes $16, but truthfully, the pharmacy is probably not making quite this much. In fact, they've barely been making it over recent years. So I think this getting rid of copay clawbacks, which we'll talk about later, and looking at the gag clause initiatives will help them. Wholesalers make $3, and of course the drug manufacturer makes the most, but they developed that drug. They manufactured it and have to pay for all of the marketing and the R&D. So here's a little bit of information about our project. We launched a report, which you'll see the URL, specialtyrxtoolkit.org. And in the rotating banner, you'll see a copy of a report we launched last October. And the report talks about how the middleman is contributing to the cost for employers and patients. We focus on how they're retaining the rebate, how they're keeping the spread between what they're charging and what the pharmacy is paying. Did I say that right? Anoop, did I say that right? Where are you? Okay, never mind. Keeping drug distribution in-house so that nobody else can fulfill a drug because they want all that money staying internally. Clawing back patient copays. How many of you are familiar with that? So the employer goes to the pharmacy and the actual drug cost is $1.61, but that patient has a $5 or $10 copay, and the patient doesn't know that, and the gag clauses will help with this, the removal of that. So the patient pays that $5 or $10 copay, and the PBM claws the rest of that back. It does not go back to the employer. It does not get kept by the pharmacy. It goes back to the PBM. So most of my members have put a clause in their contracts stating that you cannot claw copays back. And I recommend that you all check and see if you've got that in yours as well. The use of direct and indirect remuneration clawbacks at the pharmacy isn't something that directly impacts employers or patients. It's another clawback that the pharmacies have to deal with the PBM, but it does impact us in the end because we're paying the final bill. They also lock out new drugs, and the reason for this is because if a new drug comes on the market, if it comes out at net cost, meaning it's not paying rebates, or it comes out and it's less cost, the PBM does not want that new drug on the market. They'll use the excuse that we're checking out its efficacy, et cetera, but the reality is they're often locking that out because they want to make as much money as they can on the rebates for the high drugs, the high cost drugs, and the high rebated drugs on formularies for as long as they can. And then they also require price protection rebates from manufacturers, and that means that if a manufacturer does raise the cost of the drug, PBM wants to make sure they get their share. So I'm not going to read these. Let me see what my time is. Just want to stay on time. I'm going to read a few of these. These are quotes that I've been collecting from the last 12 months that employers have made at the educational programs that we have put on. And I don't know if you can read them from in the back, but manufacturers can tell you what they charge the wholesaler, but they can't talk about rebates with the PBM because of required confidentiality clauses between the two. Today, employers are not allied and have no common agenda to drive change. The people you're buying benefits from know it. You have to stand up and ask your vendors for accountability. Include questions in your RFP that asks intermediaries what they have been paid by partners in the supply chain and indicate they will be audited. You have a fiduciary duty. So if you're, I know that if you're with National RX Cooperative, they do auditing. But if you have a different contract and you're not auditing, hiring an outside auditing agency, and don't let the PBM tell you which auditing firm to use. Those are huge missed opportunities. We don't talk to employers about the concept of fiduciary responsibility. In this healthcare environment, employers will have to make ethical decisions about which drugs to cover that will require making difficult choices. Employers haven't felt there's a problem with pharmacy benefits and have been told by consultants and partners that everything is under control and they're getting the best deal possible. We want to trust our partners, but don't know what questions to ask or what to include in the RFP. Employers need help. Here's some more. Don't accept the status quo. There's a lack of PBM willingness to change, and employers need disruption and transformation. The easiest way to do this is through pharmacy benefits. If one PBM doesn't want to play, there are others waiting. A properly defined full pass-through transparent PBM or PBA, which is pharmacy benefit administrator, which tends to be a more transparent model, is clean, audit-friendly, and the best option for legal compliance, but most PBMs don't want to sell you a transparent contract. Traditional contracts are much more profitable. I'll use the example about 8 years ago of one of my members who, when transparency was first being talked about, said to their PBM, I want to know the cost differential if I do a traditional contract with you versus a transparent contract. and the PBM wanted to retain the business, so that employer saw 30% savings using a transparent contract. When that contract was up, they went back and said, okay, now I want to see what both are going to cost. And now the transparent contract was 40% more. 40% more. Because they were wanting to retain the business, and now they don't want to make less money, so they're going to add to the cost. So when I say that our costs can be increased by as much as 10 to 40% in terms of what's going on in the pharmacy benefit space, that's where that money is sitting. Don't sign a contract until you know where every penny is going. I have a few quick employer case studies that I wanted to share. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Caterpillar. Caterpillar served as their own prescription coordinator. 10, 15 years ago, they saw that costs were out of control, so they said, we're going to bring stuff in-house, and we're going to really unbundle the existing pharmacy benefit model and then put the pieces back together and remove the waste. They offer a narrow formulary based on value-based drugs. They got rid of the low-value drugs, so you don't have a huge formulary, but as Heather was sharing with us, there's plenty of drugs out there that are low value. Of course, generics are first course of action with them. They're not going to pay for some of the OTCs or some of the drugs that you can get an OTC equivalent at the store. They negotiate directly with retail pharmacies using a cost-plus model. This is one of the ways that they're saving a tremendous amount of money. They're only using the PBM for adjudicating claims. And the company has saved tens of millions of dollars each year. They've dropped the patient per prescription costs as well. Another example is several of our members are now using a value-based design that focuses on the shared value of the outcome of a drug between the member and employer. So there's 4 categories. How many of you have seen this example? Possibly, okay. Lifestyle drugs that only benefit the employee. So diet aids, cosmetic drugs, erectile dysfunction drugs, unless that person has a medical condition. The member is paying all of the amount or the greatest amount. Convenience drugs that are not essential to life or offer less costly alternatives with similar efficacy, like non-sedating antihistamines, toenail fungus creams, the employer and the member share equally in the cost. Business-preserving drugs that treat controllable health conditions, so are all of our chronic disease meds, and can impact productivity or lost work time, the employer assumes the greatest amount, and the employer assumes the greatest amount, and the employee shares a small amount. And then finally, life-preserving drugs that are associated with preservation of life, functioning of body systems, and this might be your specialty drugs. And diseases that are life-threatening, like cancer. The employer is assuming the greatest amount of cost. Now, how this works effectively is that the cost savings that they're getting from the Me Too drugs, the low-value drugs, the drugs that have OTC equivalents, and all of that is helping cover the costs for all of the chronic disease medicine, chronic disease drugs, as well as the life-saving and specialty drugs. Common sense to me. They also don't have a formulary, by the way. They just don't cover certain categories. So the employee, if they want a cancer drug and there's 4 or 5 different options, the physician gets to choose what that drug is. And again, all that money that's saved up front helps to preserve those drugs. So a quick overview of some recommendations. Require transparent pass-through models that remove the spread between the amount paid by plan and amount paid to the pharmacy. There's lots of vendors out there that are doing these things. I know that National RX Cooperative, and if I'm saying that wrong, you can yell at me later. Is it National Cooperative RX? Sorry, everybody, let's rewind and pretend I said that. Guarantee PBM contracts, and this is important language, disclose all financial flows, including all PBM revenue streams, margin pricing, formulary management fees, and data sales. And by the way, they're selling your data. Did you know that? Require pass-through for all pharmacy discounts, rebates, pharmacy spread, retail and mail order discounts, so that the true costs, not just the price, are known. Remember earlier when Alex was talking about the price? What does that mean? What is represented by that price? What are all the terms that have been come up with over the years that PBMs have used and changed in their contracts when we became knowledgeable about what that term meant, and then they just change it to something else? Ensure price protection rebates are disclosed and passed through to you. Require PBM contracts to exclude the use of copay clawbacks at the pharmacy. Use performance-based contracts and make sure you include penalties if they don't meet those goals. Incentivize members for using improved outcomes for drugs and related treatments. That's a value-based benefit environment. Negotiate directly with retail pharmacy networks for dispensing and patient care services. I'm not sure that the PBMs are doing a great job on the patient care side, or that the health plans are, which is why a lot of us have carved out specialty drugs and are relying on that care case management function. I think care case management is going to be a huge way for us to manage our populations in the future, both on the specialty drug side and the chronic disease side. Is there value in allowing the PBMs to have distribution in-house? Contracts often demand this. It's very profitable for the PBM to keep all the drugs in-house. Can you alter your benefit plan design for that? Exercise full auditing rights in PBM contracts. And so this is where we'd like to see the marketplace go. Drugs are net cost based off list price at the time of dispensing, no hidden rebates or discounts. Drug costs and clinical outcomes are balanced to maximize outcomes for total value, for total cost of care savings. Formularies are based on clinical efficacy, not rebates, discounts, exclusive contracts, or narrow networks. Clinical advanced support and management fees are separate from dispensing fees. Mail order isn't mandatory. Appropriate drug alternatives are used versus mandatory exclusions. We're seeing too much of that. Manufacturer contracts are at shared risk for product-related outcomes. That's starting to grow. Here are some resources for you that focus on PBM contracts, PBM audits, designing specialty drug benefits, a checklist for site of care management. We even included an education strategy for consumers because we are doing all this stuff in the pharmacy benefit, but we're not talking about what these biologic and specialty drugs are. A couple years ago, I saw my first commercial that said, "Now that you're on a biologic," and I thought, I know what that, twice today. I know what that means, but do my employees and family members know? No, they don't. So my final comments were at our annual conference. We have to drive innovation or it will be driven for us. Let me go back. Employers have had tons of opportunities to save money, but we let the PBMs run us into the ground. We chose not to use transparent models because the PBM offered us another 1% of savings. Put any number in there. Maybe it was 2%. We're trying to do something different, but no one is interested because they have always done things one way. As employers, if we're designing benefits that are out of reach for our members, then we're doing it wrong. And that really ties right into the high deductible health plan thing. I know so many of us have moved in that direction, but if we have really high out-of-pocket costs, and I know there's the whole skin in the game, we get that, but if it's true that 40% of people or 50% of people are making $30,000 or $40,000 a year, they cannot afford a $3,000 deductible. We have to continually be in front of where we want to go. We are the real payer, and we have to start leveraging the power we have. That's where coalitions come in, I believe. Everyone wants a seat at the table and figure this out based on a desire to do something different or better. We need to make this happen. And then finally, and this was a very large employer who said, we must walk the talk. Who is willing to play ball and walk the talk with us? So with that, I'm almost done. If there are any questions, otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Any questions, thoughts, comments? You want to yell at me, throw tomatoes? No? All right.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Our last up is Wayne Salverda, the Senior Director of Clinical Services for National Cooperative RX, which is the PBM purchasing cooperative and watchdog organization that the Alliance helped found on behalf of our members 14 years ago, back when we were attempting to become, to quote Alex Young, less sloppy and unorganized. Clearly, we knew that this area was technical and complex, and we needed dedicated expertise to help us manage this. So Wayne is responsible for the development, evaluation, recommendation, and monitoring of pharmacy benefit or PBM clinical programs and initiatives. He's available as a clinical resource to NCRX members, including a review and interpretation of data and plan design recommendations. Wayne is a licensed pharmacist with more than 20 years of pharmacy experience in PBMs, managed care, and retail pharmacy. Wayne, please join me.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be able to be here today with the Alliance members, the Alliance being a founding member of our organization. One of the things that I'm going to be touching on here in the minutes that I have is the awesomeness that Cheryl alluded to. And I'll be using some of our own experience and, as a case study of a sort to walk through some of the things that we've been doing to leverage our expertise in our relationship with our pharmacy benefit manager in managing specialty as well as the non-specialty drug spend. Cooperative represents about 290,000 lives. That correlates to about 130,000 employees. So that's on par with some of those large employers that Cheryl had alluded to, such as Caterpillar, Amazon, as well as Berkshire Hathaway and others. There's a lot of different approaches that you can look at or consider when it comes to the pharmacy benefit management. A lot of people do what everyone else has been doing. Don't necessarily want to be a lemming. We've actually had some of our member owner groups have thrown the baby out with the bathwater and actually decided, you know what, I'm no longer going to offer a drug benefit at this point, and I'm just going to have my employees pay full cost for whatever their medication is. There's a lot of things that are good with the current system, but there's also a possibility for additional innovation, transformation as well. Some of that turns out to be fruitful, some of it not so fruitful. But the approach that we've been taking at the cooperative is the last picture here. We use our expertise to build upon the rock. And it's been alluded to in a couple of the additional speaker presentations already, the importance of some of that contract language, those clawbacks, those cases where individuals pay more than the actual cost of the drug. That directly relates to the contract that's in place with those plan sponsors, and most of those situations that you see in the marketplace involve large health plans. It's typically involving an Anthem, a United, a Cigna, or an Aetna. So we take and identify our pharmacy benefit managers' strengths and weaknesses. We leverage their strengths, and then we look to develop programs and services to complement the deficiencies that we find. Part of our expertise involves monitoring and developing trends, seeing what's happening in the marketplace and responding to that. And then we've actually, over the last couple of years, worked out some very efficient processes to expedite changes, plan changes, recommendations on behalf of our member owner groups on a collective basis. So you're not left having to do this on an individual basis. I mean, most of the HR benefit folks, pharmacy is just one small piece of the pie, and it's extremely beneficial to have another organization or expertise that you can tap into, especially around the pharmacy benefit. And then the sound recommendations and delivering results is kind of our marching orders. Over the last few years, we've actually developed some very specific, and you might not know this if you're a current member owner group, but behind the scenes, we've actually have this process in place where we're looking and identifying some strategic areas to roll out, recommend to our member owner groups, and then build off of that. So we've got that infrastructure and specialty back in place in 2012, and we've continued to build upon that. So it's incredibly important to identify those market trends and those dynamics and to just continually build off that. And specialty is one of those areas where you'll see on our little list here, every year, every other year, we're doing something else to enhance that management. But it's also incredibly important not to lose sight of the non-specialty drug spend. That still represents close to 60%, and a couple of the speakers had alluded to some of that already. And a couple of the items that we actually rolled out late in 2017, our prospective and retrospective billed claim review, that actually ended up leading into a fraud, waste, and abuse program that's benefited our member owners. Some additional considerations that we'll be looking at and things that you might want to think about with your current vendors as well is leveraging other expertise that's out in the marketplace. ICER, the Institute for Clinical Economic Reviews, actually does at least one of the pharmacy benefit managers, CVS, is partnering with ICER to do a review on new specialty products that come to market. And if they have a quality adjusted life year in excess of $100,000, we're looking at not having that as a covered item. That's one way to leverage some with the manufacturers to reevaluate how they're bringing those new products to market. Another area that we'll be looking at very closely in 2019 is essential specialty coverage, and we've actually done this with a couple of our member groups already. And the third area with additional considerations relates to value-based contracts. Historically, this has been confined mostly to the health plan, large health plan players who have access to both the pharmacy and the medical data. But now we're starting to see more and more of this get leveraged within the pharmacy benefit managers as well. And there's three aspects of value-based contracts: outcomes-based, indication-based, and the expenditure or cost gap. And those are areas that can provide some means to help leverage, ensure that quality and the lowest cost for some of these medications. Illustrative example of some non-specialty products for perspective purposes. For our book of business, the average specialty drug cost is a little over $5,000. All these products noted on here are non-specialty drugs, but you can see the spectrum for any one of the four products listed on here, and I'm going to pick on the epinephrine auto-injector as an example. You can, a plan participant can get something as inexpensive as $110, or it could cost almost $5,000 for an epinephrine auto-injector. And the same holds true for some of these other products as well. Cheryl had alluded to some of the comments around not covering certain over-the-counter products in some case, or prescription products if there's over-the-counter alternatives. That omeprazole sodium bicarbonate, great example. The generic over-the-counter prescription product, pretty inexpensive. If you get the brand name product, thousands of dollars. And these are products that could potentially be much higher volume than what we see with the specialty drug users. I mean, epinephrine auto-injectors alone, you're going to see about 1% of your population using those products. So do not lose sight of the non-specialty component here. Another example, Duexis. Crap product from my perspective. Combination of two ingredients that are generically available over the counter. Purchase them outright for less than $50. The generic options through the prescription benefit even less. The benefit of having the manufacturer combine them into one pill into the Duexis, it's going to cost a plan sponsor almost $3,000 for something like this. And the way they leverage that market is with these copay offset cards. In this case, you can see that the member pays $0. So even if the member had a high deductible health plan, they fork out $1,500, $2,000, the plan participant gets that all back through the copay offset card, and they're set for the year. You do not want to cover stuff like this. Formulary management is incredibly important, both on the specialty and non-specialty drug front. Fraud, waste, and abuse is another area. And you might not think this actually touches on specialty, but it does. We implemented a process that we look at those high claim reviews. And I actually had a paper claim come in from a pharmacy in Florida for a participant up in Alaska, and they wanted reimbursement of close to $9,000 for a product that they said that they had dispensed. And I'm like, well, first of all, what pharmacy would ever let $9,000 go out the front door without ensuring payment first? The paper claim receipt looked incredibly convincing, but I'm like, no, we're not paying for it. And most of this, the fraud is in the Deep South. A lot of pharmacies down in Texas and Florida are actually the top two areas. And collectively, we found within our own block of business that what we rolled out just on the fraud waste component here was representing about 1 to 2% of overall drug spend. For benchmarking purposes and to show some of the benefit of the programs that we've actually rolled out, I went and did a little homework here and pulled together some trends as well as the associated spends from some of the major competitors or benchmarks in the industry. And I was very pleased that the cooperative was performing extremely well, and this is due to a combination of both getting that infrastructure set in place early on, as well as building upon that infrastructure and working well with our pharmacy benefit manager. It isn't always the case. We have some bumps in the road every once in a while, but we've got a lot of processes that have been very beneficial for our member owner groups. And even if you look at this over our last 10-year history period of time, we've demonstrated and we've been outperforming the performance of those benchmarks. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take some of those. Otherwise, I'm going to let Cheryl wrap us up.
Any questions for Wayne? All right, thank you, Wayne. So I do want to thank you all for coming today, and thank you again to our sponsors, Delta Dental of Wisconsin, National Cooperative RX, Novo Nordisk, Group Health Cooperative of South Central Wisconsin, Pfizer, and the National Hemophilia Foundation. We really appreciate your willingness to be here and to showcase your services to our members. And we look forward to seeing you at upcoming events after the new year in January. So happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas. Please watch for an evaluation of today's event in your email inbox. And we encourage you not only to share your feedback on today's session, but to also give us some feedback on future health policy resolutions you'd like to see us address. We'll be posting blog posts, summaries, and copies of the presentations on our website. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of the day.